a flight attendant thought she could humiliate a billionaire by throwing him off a plane. She had no idea she had just made the worst mistake of her life, because just weeks later, he didn't just own the airline, he owned her future. But what he did next, no one saw it coming. Before we get into this unbelievable story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from people all around the world. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss another jaw-dropping tale of power, revenge, and redemption. The air was crisp with the scent of jet fuel and freshly brewed coffee as passengers moved through the opulent first-class lounge of JFK International Airport. The hum of hushed conversations and the occasional clink of champagne glasses created an atmosphere of quiet luxury. The rich and powerful sat in plush leather chairs waiting to board their flights, their lives dictated by deals made across continents and meetings scheduled in multiple time zones. Among them sat Christopher Baldwin, a man who, despite his unimaginable wealth, never felt the need to flaunt it. Dressed in a well-tailored, yet understated navy blue suit, he exuded a quiet authority. His presence was paradoxical, both unassuming and commanding at the same time. He didn't wear a flashy watch, didn't surround himself with bodyguards, and carried nothing but a leather briefcase and his passport. To anyone else, he might have seemed like an ordinary businessman, just another well-dressed traveler on his way to close a deal. But those who knew his name understood that Christopher Baldwin was anything but ordinary. At 42 years old, he was one of the most powerful men in the financial world. A self-made billionaire whose empire spanned multiple industries, from technology to aviation. His investments were so vast and strategically placed that a simple decision from him could shift global markets. And yet, he preferred to move in silence, letting the world underestimate him while he played his game. He glanced at his watch, 5:45 p.m. His flight to London was scheduled for departure in 45 minutes. He took one last sip of his espresso before standing up, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve and heading toward Gate 14, where his first-class ticket awaited. An unexpected obstacle. As he approached the boarding area, the gate agent greeted him with a polite nod, scanning his boarding pass without hesitation. The first-class passengers were ushered in first, gliding past the economy travelers like royalty moving through a crowd of commoners. Christopher stepped onto the jet bridge, the hum of the aircraft's engines growing louder. When he entered the first-class cabin, the air was cooler, the scent of fresh leather and expensive cologne filling the space. He found his seat, 2A, a window seat with a panoramic view of the tarmac. He placed his briefcase in the overhead compartment and settled in, pulling out his tablet to review some last-minute reports. Everything was routine until she arrived. Emily, she was young, perhaps in her late 20s, with sharp, symmetrical features and the kind of artificial smile that never quite reached the eyes. Her uniform was pristine, her blonde hair styled into a perfect chignon, and her posture exuded the confidence of someone who had been in the job for years. And yet there was something else about her, a quiet air of entitlement, a subtle disdain in her gaze as she moved through the cabin. She walked past several passengers without issue. A white businessman in an expensive Tom Ford suit? No problem. A middle-aged hedge fund manager sipping a glass of Dom Perignon? Perfectly acceptable. Then her gaze landed on Christopher. The shift was immediate. Her expression stiffened ever so slightly, as if something didn't sit right. She hesitated for just a second, so brief that most people wouldn't have noticed, but Christopher did. He always noticed. "Sir," she said, her voice polite yet strangely firm, "can I see your boarding pass?" Christopher looked up from his tablet, one brow slightly raised. "I already scanned it at the gate." His tone was calm, controlled. "I understand," Emily continued, her voice carrying the forced patience of someone speaking to a child, "but I just need to verify your seat assignment." Christopher exhaled silently, sensing exactly where this was going. He had seen this playbook before, the quiet assumptions, the unnecessary verifications, the condescending tones reserved only for people like him who didn't look like they belonged. "Of course," he said smoothly, reaching into his pocket and handing her the boarding pass. Emily studied it, her lips pressing together as if she expected to find a flaw, a mistake, an excuse to remove him. But there was none. Her gaze flickered between the ticket and Christopher, her disbelief poorly masked. "This is for first class," she said, almost as if confirming it for herself rather than for him. Christopher gave her a small, unreadable smile. "That's correct." A brief pause. Emily hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, as if her mind couldn't reconcile the image in front of her. A black man, alone, sitting comfortably in a space usually reserved for the ultra-elite. The moment stretched just long enough to make the surrounding passengers notice the tension. Some shifted in their seats, uncomfortable yet unwilling to intervene. Finally, Emily forced a tight-lipped smile and handed back the ticket. "Enjoy your flight," she said, her voice lacking warmth as she moved on. Christopher watched her go, his expression neutral. He had been through this before. Too many times. He thought that would be the end of it. He was wrong. The unraveling. 10 minutes passed, the flight crew made their final announcements, and the plane doors were sealed. Passengers settled in, preparing for takeoff. Christopher was about to return to his tablet when he sensed someone approaching again. He looked up. Emily. She was standing in front of him again, a tight expression on her face. "Sir," she said, her tone sharper this time, "I'm going to need you to step off the plane." For the first time, Christopher's expression shifted slightly. His dark eyes locked onto hers, calm yet dangerous. "Excuse me." "I spoke with my supervisor," Emily continued, crossing her arms, "and we need to double-check something regarding your ticket. It seems there was a mix-up." Christopher leaned back slightly, studying her. "A mix-up?" "Yes," she said, her voice firm. "If you could just step off the plane, we'll sort it out." Silence. Passengers were watching now. Some whispered. Others turned their heads, pretending not to see. Christopher exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. He could have fought back. He could have demanded an explanation, made a scene. But he didn't. Instead, he did something that terrified Emily more than anything else. He smiled. It was a slow, calculated smile, not of submission, but of a man who had already decided exactly what he was going to do next. Without another word, he stood up, adjusted his suit, and stepped off the plane. And just like that, Emily sealed her fate, without even realizing it. The air in the jet bridge was noticeably colder than in the cabin. Christopher Baldwin stepped onto the terminal floor with measured steps, his demeanor still eerily calm. But if one looked closely, if one truly studied his expression, they would see the storm brewing beneath the surface. He had been in situations like this before. He had been doubted, questioned, underestimated, all because he didn't fit the image people expected in certain spaces. And yet, each time he had let it slide. This time, however, was different, because this time they had made a mistake. They had embarrassed him. Publicly, and in Christopher Baldwin's world, that was unforgivable. Passengers watch in uncomfortable silence. Inside the first-class cabin, the tension was thick. The remaining passengers had watched everything unfold, from Emily's needless insistence on verifying Christopher's ticket to her eventual decision to remove him from the plane altogether. Some of them felt uncomfortable. They weren't blind. They had seen how Emily hadn't questioned a single other passenger in the way she had questioned him. And yet, no one said a word. A middle-aged man in an expensive suit shifted in his seat, clearing his throat awkwardly. A woman 2 rows ahead adjusted her sunglasses and kept her eyes on her book, pretending to be absorbed in the pages. But silence was complicity, and every single person in that cabin knew it. One of the passengers, a young tech entrepreneur named Liam Carter, finally leaned toward the hedge fund manager sitting beside him and muttered under his breath, "That was kind of messed up, wasn't it?" The older man exhaled heavily, running a hand through his graying hair. Yeah, he admitted it. But what can you do? Liam shook his head, uncomfortable with the entire situation. But he didn't press further. That was how these things always played out, wasn't it? The supervisor's empty apology. Back in the terminal, Christopher found himself standing face to face with a man who clearly didn't want to be here. Elliot Sampson, the airline's shift supervisor, a nervous looking man in his mid 40s. Elliot had been called down at the last minute after Emily had insisted that there was an issue with Christopher's ticket. But now, after reviewing the manifest, he knew the truth. There was no issue at all. Emily had simply removed Christopher because she could. And now Elliot had to fix it. Mr. Baldwin, Elliot began, his voice carefully neutral, I apologize for the inconvenience. There seems to have been a misunderstanding regarding your boarding status. Christopher tilted his head slightly, studying him. A misunderstanding, he repeated. Elliot swallowed. He could feel Christopher's sharp gaze dissecting every word he was about to say. Yes, sir, Elliot continued. You were mistakenly removed from the flight. Your seat in first class was valid, and we'd be happy to reboard you immediately. Christopher didn't blink. Interesting. Excuse me, sir? Tell me, Mr. Sampson, Christopher said slowly. Was anyone else removed from that plane? Elliot hesitated. No, sir. Did anyone else's ticket need to be verified multiple times? A longer pause. No, sir. Christopher nodded, his expression unreadable. I see. Elliot shifted on his feet. He had the distinct sense that Christopher wasn't merely processing the situation. He was calculating something, and that scared him. Meanwhile, back on the plane, Emily stood near the front of the first-class cabin, wearing a satisfied smirk. She had done what she believed was right. In her mind, she had upheld the airline's standards, maintained order, ensured that the right kind of people occupied first class. And Christopher Baldwin? She had pegged him as one of those men, the kind who would walk away quietly, maybe complain to customer service later, but ultimately do nothing. But she had miscalculated. Badly. She didn't notice that some of the passengers were still watching her, whispering amongst themselves. She didn't see the unease spreading through the cabin, the growing realization that she had just done something that would come back to haunt her. But one person did. Liam Carter, the tech entrepreneur, frowned as he observed her smug posture. She thinks she won, he muttered under his breath. The hedge fund manager beside him scoffed. Yeah, well, she's about to learn a very expensive lesson. Christopher's decision, a move that will shake the airline industry. Christopher remained silent as Elliot continued to ramble through his half-hearted apology. He had already made his decision. He wasn't just going to board another flight. He wasn't going to file a complaint and let it disappear into the corporate void. He was going to take everything. His voice was measured when he finally spoke. Tell your pilot to take off. Elliot blinked. Sir? I won't be reboarding this flight, Christopher said smoothly. But trust me, I'll be seeing this airline again very, very soon. Elliot couldn't hide the chill that ran down his spine at those words. And with that, Christopher Baldwin turned on his heel and walked away, his mind already working through the first steps of his plan. Back on the plane, passengers began to wonder. Back in first class, the plane's engines roared to life. The pilot's voice came over the intercom announcing final clearance for takeoff. Passengers settled in, fastening their seatbelts. Liam, however, pulled out his phone and did a quick Google search. And when he saw what popped up, his eyes widened in shock. He turned to the hedge fund manager beside him. Oh my God! The older man glanced at him. What? Liam swallowed hard. Do you know who that guy was? Who? The guy they just kicked off the plane. Liam turned his phone around, showing the screen. That was Christopher Baldwin. The hedge fund manager's expression immediately changed. Wait, Christopher Baldwin? The billionaire? Yeah, Liam said. And if what I just read about him is true, that flight attendant just made the biggest mistake of her life. They both turned their gazes toward Emily, who still stood near the front of the cabin, oblivious to the storm she had just unleashed. The plane lifted off the ground, and somewhere in a high-rise office overlooking Manhattan, Christopher Baldwin's legal team was already preparing for war. Christopher Baldwin moved through the terminal with an eerie sense of calm. His steps were measured, his hands tucked into the pockets of his tailored suit, his expression unreadable. To anyone watching, he looked like just another passenger who had missed his flight. Perhaps slightly inconvenienced, but nothing more. But beneath that exterior, something was awakening. This wasn't just about a flight. This was about humiliation, about power, and about the lesson he was about to teach to an entire industry. He reached an empty row of seats near a floor-to-ceiling window, the view of the departing planes stretching out before him. The skyline of New York City loomed in the distance, but Christopher's mind wasn't on the city. It was on Emily. It was on the airline that had just thrown him off a flight without justification. And it was on the countless other times he had been quietly questioned, doubted, and scrutinized in places where he was the wealthiest man in the room. No more. Slowly, Christopher pulled out his phone, tapped on his private contact list, and scrolled down to a name: Grayson Langford. He hit call. Grayson Langford was a man who prided himself on being impossible to surprise. As one of the most ruthless corporate attorneys in the world, he had been involved in hostile takeovers, billion-dollar acquisitions, and backroom deals that never made the headlines. But when his phone rang at exactly 6:10 p.m., 25 minutes after Christopher had been kicked off the flight, he knew something big was about to happen. Baldwin, Grayson answered smoothly. By the airline. Silence. Grayson leaned forward in his chair, gripping his pen. I'm sorry, what? Christopher's voice remained calm. By the airline. Grayson exhaled sharply. Jesus Christ, that's a hell of a move. Can it be done? Grayson smirked. With your money? Of course, the real question is, do you want to do this cleanly, or do you want to take it by force? Christopher watched the plane lift off from the runway. His voice was calm, almost indifferent. I don't care how you do it, Grayson. Just make sure that when that plane lands, I own it. Grayson let out a slow whistle. Hostile takeover it is. The takeover begins. The wheels were set in motion immediately. Within minutes, Grayson's team of corporate sharks were on their phones, reaching out to every major investor in the airline, identifying which board members were weakest, which ones could be flipped, and which ones would need to be removed by force. The airline in question, Imperial Airways, wasn't small. It was a multi-billion-dollar giant with international routes and government contracts. But that didn't matter, because Christopher Baldwin wasn't just wealthy. He was a force of nature. By 6:45 p.m., shares of Imperial Airways began to move. Subtly at first, but fast. At 7 p.m., Christopher's investment firm had quietly acquired 6% of the company. At 7:30 p.m., that number rose to 15%. By 8:15 p.m., a significant 29% stake had been taken. And by midnight, Grayson's team had secured a controlling 51% of the company. Christopher Baldwin now owned the airline that had humiliated him hours earlier. But the real fun was only about to begin. The CEO's desperation miles away, in a high-rise corporate office, Daniel Clarkson, CEO of Imperial Airways, was having the worst night of his career. His phone had been ringing nonstop. Emails were flooding in from shareholders. Something was happening to the company, something unstoppable. And when his assistant rushed in, pale-faced, holding a printout of the latest stock acquisition reports, Clarkson felt his stomach drop. The name at the top of the document sent a chill through his spine. Christopher Baldwin. Clarkson's hands clenched. He had heard of Baldwin. Everyone in the financial world had. He was a man who moved in silence, a billionaire who didn't just play the game. He rewrote the rules entirely, and now Baldwin was coming for him. Sir, his assistant stammered. What do we do? Clarkson swallowed hard. He only had one option. Call him, he muttered. Now. Christopher answers the call. At 12:05 a.m., Christopher's phone buzzed. He was in his penthouse, standing by the window overlooking the city. A glass of scotch rested on the table beside him. He didn't need to look at the caller ID, he already knew. With a small smirk, he answered, "Mr. Clarkson," Christopher greeted smoothly. There was a pause on the other end, then a forced chuckle. "Mr. Baldwin, I wasn't expecting to speak with you tonight." And yet, here we are. Clarkson cleared his throat. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding." Christopher swirled his scotch in the glass. "A misunderstanding?" "Yes," Clarkson said quickly. "Perhaps we can discuss this. There's no need for aggression. If you were unhappy with your flight experience, I'd be more than happy to offer compensation." Christopher laughed softly. Clarkson stopped speaking immediately. That laugh wasn't humorous. It was lethal. "Daniel," Christopher said, his voice dropping into something dangerous, "I don't want compensation. I don't want an apology. I want control." Silence. Then Christopher delivered the final blow. "And in case you haven't checked the numbers, I already have it." Clarkson's blood ran cold. Christopher took a slow sip of his drink. "Tomorrow morning, you'll resign. The board will accept my leadership. And this company, your company, will be mine." Clarkson's mouth went dry. "And if I refuse?" Christopher's smirk widened. "Then I bury you." The line went dead. A new dawn. At 6 a.m., news broke. Christopher Baldwin acquires majority stake in Imperial Airways overnight. The aviation industry was in shock. The stock market went wild, and inside the first-class lounge at Heathrow Airport, where Emily had just landed from her overnight shift, she picked up her phone, only to see a headline that made her heart stop. Her new boss was the man she had thrown off the plane. The sun had barely risen over Manhattan, but inside the corporate headquarters of Imperial Airways, the boardroom was already in a state of chaos. Executives who had slept soundly the night before were now scrambling to comprehend the catastrophe that had unfolded in a matter of hours. The numbers didn't lie. Christopher Baldwin now owned 51% of the company, and if there was one thing everyone in that boardroom knew about Baldwin, it was this. He didn't make deals. He made decisions. CEO Daniel Clarkson had barely slept. His mind had raced all night, playing out every possible strategy. He had called favors, reached out to investors, tried to find a way to block the takeover. Nothing worked. Now, as he sat at the head of the boardroom table, his grip tightened around his pen while the executives around him argued in frantic whispers. Clarkson took a deep breath and slammed his fist against the table, silencing the room. "Enough!" he barked. "We're not going to roll over and let Baldwin take this company without a fight. There's still time to push back." An older executive, Martin Reynolds, shook his head grimly. "Daniel, it's over. He owns us. You know that." Clarkson's jaw tightened. "He doesn't own anything until the board confirms it." "Oh," the voice came from the doorway. And just like that, the temperature in the room dropped. Every head turned toward the entrance. And standing there, dressed in a sharp black suit, was Christopher Baldwin himself, the new owner of Imperial Airways. Christopher walks into the lion's den. Christopher stepped inside with the quiet confidence of a man who had already won. There was no rush in his steps, no emotion in his eyes. He walked to the head of the table, directly across from Clarkson, and slowly unbuttoned his jacket before taking a seat. He clasped his hands together, leaning forward slightly. "Let's begin, shall we?" Clarkson, to his credit, didn't back down, not yet. He squared his shoulders. "Mr. Baldwin, I think we need to discuss—" Christopher cut him off with a single movement, a subtle raise of his hand. The silence that followed was absolute. Then, in a voice so calm it was almost chilling, Christopher spoke. "I don't discuss. I dictate." The boardroom power shift. Christopher's words hung in the air like a loaded gun. Clarkson opened his mouth to respond, but Christopher was already sliding a stack of documents across the table. Clarkson hesitated before picking them up. His eyes scanned the first page, then the second, then the third. His face paled. The papers were resignation agreements, not just for him, for half the board. Clarkson looked up, his hands trembling. You can't do this." Christopher's expression didn't change. "Oh, but I can." He leaned back slightly. "And I already have." Martin Reynolds, the older executive, rubbed a hand over his face and sighed. "Clarkson, he's already spoken to the investors. The vote is a formality at this point. He has the power." Clarkson shook his head in disbelief. "You've planned this for months, haven't you?" Christopher's lips curved into the faintest smirk. "Try hours." Clarkson felt sick. This wasn't just a takeover, this was an execution. He exhaled shakily, realizing there was only one way out of this. "What do you want, Baldwin?" Clarkson muttered. "Do you want me to just walk away?" Christopher's smile vanished. He didn't speak for a moment. Then, with a voice as sharp as a blade, he answered, "I want you to remember this moment for the rest of your life." Clarkson swallowed hard. "I want you to remember that I didn't buy this airline because I needed another business," Christopher continued, his tone turning dangerously low. "I bought it because one of your employees disrespected me, because she assumed that a man like me didn't belong in first class." The room was silent. The executives shifted uncomfortably, knowing exactly what he meant. Christopher placed both hands on the table. No, Clarkson. I don't want you to walk away. I want you to be dragged out, and I want every single person in this room to watch." Clarkson's breath caught in his throat. Christopher turned to the security guard standing by the door. "Escort Mr. Clarkson off the premises." The guard hesitated, then stepped forward. Clarkson's rage finally exploded. "You son of a—" Christopher didn't blink. "Goodbye, Daniel." Clarkson was dragged out of the boardroom. And just like that, Imperial Airways had a new king. Across the ocean at Heathrow Airport, Emily had just landed. She stretched her arms, adjusting her uniform, completely unaware of what had just happened, completely unaware that her world was about to be turned upside down. As she reached for her phone, she saw a flood of missed calls from the airline's corporate office. Her stomach tightened. She clicked on the first news alert that appeared, and when she saw the headline, her blood ran cold. Christopher Baldwin acquires Imperial Airways in hostile takeover. Her vision blurred. Her hands shook. She whispered the words out loud, her voice barely audible. "Oh my God!" Her new boss, Astorwin, was the man she had thrown off the plane. The clock read 3:27 a.m. when Christopher Baldwin walked onto the top floor of Imperial Airways corporate headquarters, his steps echoing against the marble floors. The building was his now. Everything inside it, every office, every desk, every employee, they all worked for him. But Christopher wasn't here to celebrate. He had one final move to make. And by sunrise, the world would know exactly who was in charge. Inside the executive conference room, the remaining board members sat in eerie silence waiting for him. Some of them had resisted the takeover. Others had jumped ship the moment Clarkson had been dragged out of the building. Now there was only one thing left to do. Christopher took his seat at the head of the table, the chair still warm from where Clarkson had sat hours earlier. He set down a single document, a final acquisition contract. He didn't bother addressing the room right away. He let the tension simmer, let them feel the weight of his presence. Finally, he spoke. "Sign it." No introductions, no explanations. Just a command. The voice came from the doorway. And just like that, the temperature in the room dropped. Every head turned toward the entrance. And standing there, dressed in a sharp black suit, was Christopher Baldwin himself, the new owner of Imperial Airways. Christopher walks into the lion's den. Christopher stepped inside with the quiet confidence of a man who had already won. There was no rush in his steps, no emotion in his eyes. He walked to the head of the table, directly across from Clarkson, and slowly unbuttoned his jacket before taking a seat. He clasped his hands together, leaning forward slightly. "Let's begin, shall we?" Clarkson, to his credit, didn't back down, not yet. He squared his shoulders. "Mr. Baldwin, I think we need to discuss—" Christopher cut him off with a single movement, a subtle raise of his hand. The silence that followed was absolute. Then, in a voice so calm it was almost chilling, Christopher spoke. "I don't discuss. I dictate." The boardroom power shift. Christopher's words hung in the air like a loaded gun. Clarkson opened his mouth to respond, but Christopher was already sliding a stack of documents across the table. Clarkson hesitated before picking them up. His eyes scanned the first page, then the second, then the third. His face paled. The papers were resignation agreements, not just for him, for half the board. Clarkson looked up, his hands trembling. You can't do this." Christopher's expression didn't change. "Oh, but I can." He leaned back slightly. "And I already have." Martin Reynolds, the older executive, rubbed a hand over his face and sighed. "Clarkson, he's already spoken to the investors. The vote is a formality at this point. He has the power." Clarkson shook his head in disbelief. "You've planned this for months, haven't you?" Christopher's lips curved into the faintest smirk. "Try hours." Clarkson felt sick. This wasn't just a takeover, this was an execution. He exhaled shakily, realizing there was only one way out of this. "What do you want, Baldwin?" Clarkson muttered. "Do you want me to just walk away?" Christopher's smile vanished. He didn't speak for a moment. Then, with a voice as sharp as a blade, he answered, "I want you to remember this moment for the rest of your life." Clarkson swallowed hard. "I want you to remember that I didn't buy this airline because I needed another business," Christopher continued, his tone turning dangerously low. "I bought it because one of your employees disrespected me, because she assumed that a man like me didn't belong in first class." The room was silent. The executives shifted uncomfortably, knowing exactly what he meant. Christopher placed both hands on the table. No, Clarkson. I don't want you to walk away. I want you to be dragged out, and I want every single person in this room to watch." Clarkson's breath caught in his throat. Christopher turned to the security guard standing by the door. "Escort Mr. Clarkson off the premises." The guard hesitated, then stepped forward. Clarkson's rage finally exploded. "You son of a—" Christopher didn't blink. "Goodbye, Daniel." Clarkson was dragged out of the boardroom. And just like that, Imperial Airways had a new king. Across the ocean at Heathrow Airport, Emily had just landed. She stretched her arms, adjusting her uniform, completely unaware of what had just happened, completely unaware that her world was about to be turned upside down. As she reached for her phone, she saw a flood of missed calls from the airline's corporate office. Her stomach tightened. She clicked on the first news alert that appeared, and when she saw the headline, her blood ran cold. Christopher Baldwin acquires Imperial Airways in hostile takeover. Her vision blurred. Her hands shook. She whispered the words out loud, her voice barely audible. "Oh my God!" Her new boss, Astorwin, was the man she had thrown off the plane. The clock read 3:27 a.m. when Christopher Baldwin walked onto the top floor of Imperial Airways corporate headquarters, his steps echoing against the marble floors. The building was his now. Everything inside it, every office, every desk, every employee, they all worked for him. But Christopher wasn't here to celebrate. He had one final move to make. And by sunrise, the world would know exactly who was in charge. Inside the executive conference room, The remaining board members sat in eerie silence waiting for him. Some of them had resisted the takeover. Others had jumped ship the moment Clarkson had been dragged out of the building. Now there was only one thing left to do. Christopher took his seat at the head of the table, the chair still warm from where Clarkson had sat hours earlier. He set down a single document, a final acquisition contract. He didn't bother addressing the room right away. He let the tension simmer, let them feel the weight of his presence. Finally, he spoke. Sign it. No introductions, no explanations. Just a command. The worst part? Even the passengers knew now. People came to her counter just to mock her. Hey, aren't you that flight attendant? One man smirked as he handed over his passport. Emily forced a tight smile. I don't know what you're talking about. The man laughed. You do. But hey, maybe if you're nice to me, I won't have you removed from your job. His friends laughed. Emily's cheeks burned with humiliation, but she said nothing. She had no choice but to stand there and take it. Christopher watches from the shadows. Christopher Baldwin had never once visited the customer service desk. Not physically, but he watched everything. He had access to every security camera, every report, every interaction. And he saw Emily breaking. Every day she stood behind that desk, her shoulders a little stiffer, her gaze a little emptier. And yet, he still wasn't satisfied, because she still hadn't truly felt the depth of what she had done. So he made one final move. The final test, a few days later, Emily received an email from HR. Subject, new special assignment. Her heart sank. She opened it with shaking hands. Emily, effective immediately, you have been reassigned to oversee first-class service on an upcoming flight from New York to London. The lead passenger will be Christopher Baldwin. Your presence has been personally requested. Emily's blood ran cold. This was it, the moment she had been dreading. She had spent weeks being humiliated, diminished, erased, and now she was being forced to face him again. As his flight attendant, as his servant. Her hands curled into fists. She wanted to run, she wanted to fight, but she could do neither. Because Christopher Baldwin owned her fate now. And whatever came next, she would have no choice but to endure it. The day of the flight dawned gray and overcast, as if the sky itself mourned the impending reckoning. Emily Dawson arrived at JFK Airport with a heavy heart, her steps slow and hesitant. Every footstep echoed the weight of her failures and the humiliation that had followed her like a shadow, ever since Christopher Baldwin's takeover of Imperial Airways. Today, however, wasn't just any ordinary day. It was the day she would once again come face to face with the man who had upended her life. Inside the bustling terminal, passengers hurried to their gates, their chatter a backdrop to Emily's silent despair. She was escorted by a stern-faced HR representative to the exclusive first-class boarding area designated for the flight. A flight that was now the stage for her ultimate test. Despite her best efforts to steel herself, every fiber of her being trembled at the thought of serving Christopher Baldwin once more. At the gate, she watched as the first-class cabin filled slowly. Her eyes darted from one polished seat to another, each one a reminder of the luxury she had once helped create and now was forced to serve. The flight attendants, dressed in crisp uniforms, moved about with professional efficiency, yet even they seemed to cast occasional sympathetic glances in her direction. Before long, the boarding call for Flight 307 to London rang over the speakers. Emily took a deep breath and, with a final silent plea to herself, stepped forward. The tension in her chest felt almost tangible, as if she could physically feel the combined weight of every whisper, every headline, and every judgmental look she had ever received. Inside the aircraft, the cabin was pristine, an oasis of comfort and exclusivity. The soft hum of the engines, the low murmur of conversations, and the clink of fine china all underscored the refined ambiance of first class. Emily made her way down the narrow aisle, her eyes fixed on the rows of passengers already settled into their seats. Then, as if scripted in slow motion, he appeared. Christopher Baldwin, unmistakable in his quiet authority, sat in a window seat near the front, his presence radiating an almost imperceptible intensity. His dark eyes met hers for a fleeting second, and in that moment a silent communication passed between them, one that spoke of power, retribution, and a legacy of consequences. Emily paused, her hands trembling as she adjusted her service cart. For a moment, the world around her seemed to dim. Every sound faded to a dull hum. All that remained was the burning ache of regret and the cold, unwavering gaze of the man she once wronged. She moved forward, forcing a professional smile, though it barely concealed the storm raging inside. "Good evening, Mr. Baldwin," she greeted in a voice that quivered despite her effort to remain composed. Baldwin's lips twitched in a subtle acknowledgement. No warmth, only the certainty of command. He didn't speak. Instead, he merely gestured with a slight nod that beckoned her closer. Emily approached his row, every step feeling like a descent further into her own despair. As she reached his seat, she discreetly prepared the service tray, her mind churning with memories of that fateful day when she had dared to question him, only to have him cast her aside with a single decisive act. Now, the echoes of that day were back, amplified by every pair of eyes in the cabin that seemed to watch her every move. She placed a small menu and a glass of chilled champagne on the fold-out table before him. For a brief second, she hesitated. In her mind, she rehearsed apologies and explanations that would somehow make amends for the past. But as her eyes met Baldwin's, all she felt was the cold certainty that words were now futile. Baldwin's gaze was too hard, too calculating, a reminder that his decision had been irrevocable. Minutes passed as the aircraft ascended into a vast, indifferent sky. Outside, the endless clouds seemed to reflect the emptiness Emily felt within. Inside, the air was filled with an uncomfortable silence. Passengers sipped their drinks and exchanged murmurs, but none dared to comment on the charged atmosphere between the flight attendant and the man in the window seat. It wasn't long before the flight attendants began their in-flight service. Emily moved down the aisle, replenishing drinks and answering polite but pointed questions. Yet, every time she passed by Baldwin, his gaze would follow her, a silent reminder of the power he wielded. It was as if the entire flight had become a living tableau of her downfall and his ascension. As the flight progressed, the tension began to weave itself into the fabric of the journey. Baldwin occasionally scribbled notes on a legal pad, occasionally glanced out the window, but never once offered a word to break the silence. Emily busied herself with her tasks, each movement executed with mechanical precision, though inside she battled waves of shame and anger. The murmurs of discontent from nearby passengers, snatches of whispered conversation, furtive glances exchanged, fueled her inner torment. Every gesture of sympathy, every furrowed brow from a fellow traveler was a stark reminder that her fall from grace was now public spectacle. During the mid-flight service break, when the cabin lights were dimmed to encourage relaxation, Emily found a moment of solitude. She retreated to the small service closet at the end of the cabin, a place that had become her sanctuary and her prison all at once. There, in the cramped silence, she allowed herself to be vulnerable. The adrenaline of the past few hours drained away, replaced by the crushing weight of reality. She replayed every moment in her mind, the humiliation, the gossip, the fierce determination in Baldwin's eyes, and felt the full measure of her disgrace. Tears welled in her eyes as she confronted the undeniable truth. She had been not only demoted, but transformed into a living reminder of what happens when one underestimates the wrong person. The pain was not just professional, it was personal, reaching deep into the core of her identity. She had built her career on a foundation of pride, and now that foundation was crumbling, piece by piece, under the relentless pressure of public and private scorn. After what felt like an eternity, the service break ended. Emily emerged from the closet, her face streaked with silent tears that she quickly wiped away with the back of her hand. She returned to the cabin, her steps heavier than before. Every interaction now seemed loaded with meaning, every glance from a passenger or colleague a reminder of her irrevocable fall. Back at his seat, Christopher Baldwin continued to observe her. He had been watching from the moment she set foot on the plane, his expression a mask of indifference that belied the storm of satisfaction within. Yet, even as he basked in the quiet triumph of his calculated revenge, there was something in his gaze, a fleeting, almost imperceptible flicker of pity or regret. It was as if for a moment he recognized the tragedy of a life consumed by ambition and arrogance. As the flight neared its destination, the cabin lights slowly brightened. The aircraft began its descent into London, and a hushed murmur of anticipation rippled through the passengers. For many, the journey had been a pleasant escape. For Emily, it had been a relentless, torturous reminder of every misstep and every harsh word spoken at her expense. When the plane finally touched down, the door opened, and passengers began to disembark, Emily lingered a moment longer in her seat as if she could somehow delay the inevitable. The final act of this humiliating drama was about to unfold. Christopher Baldwin stood as well, gathering his belongings with deliberate care. His presence was magnetic, drawing curious stares even as he walked through the cabin toward the exit. Emily's heart pounded in her ears as she followed the stream of passengers off the plane. Outside, the cool London air did little to cool the fiery shame that blazed within her. As she stepped into the terminal, her eyes met those of a small crowd of reporters and onlookers who had been tracking the flight. The cameras flashed, microphones extended like probing fingers. In that moment, the full scope of her public disgrace was laid bare. Every whispered comment, every critical headline, every social media post she had ever imagined now converged into a single overwhelming reality. She was a pariah, a living testament to the downfall of arrogance. And standing before her was Christopher Baldwin, now the undisputed master of Imperial Airways, his expression unreadable as he greeted the media with calm efficiency. The flashbulbs of the cameras captured everything. The sorrow in Emily's eyes, the cold resolve in Baldwin's demeanor, and the silent drama that had unfolded high above the clouds. For Emily, the flight had not only changed her career, it had altered her very sense of self. The journey, once a symbol of luxury and success, had become the stage for her ultimate humiliation and the beginning of a new, uncertain chapter in her life. As the crowd dispersed and the reporters moved on to the next story, Emily felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. The flight had changed everything. For Baldwin, it was a victory that cemented his power. For her, it was a final, crushing blow that left her questioning her worth. And as she looked up at the towering silhouette of Imperial Airways headquarters, she knew that her struggle was far from over. The scars of this day would remain with her, a permanent reminder of the cost of underestimating the wrong man. Christopher Baldwin sat in his penthouse office, high above the city skyline, watching the sun rise over London. It was a view he had seen 1,000 times before, yet this morning it felt different. Everything felt different. The empire he had built, the power he had amassed, the control he had exerted over Imperial Airways. It should have felt satisfying, complete, final, absolute. And yet, deep in his chest, there was a weight he hadn't expected. He had won. Emily Dawson had been reduced to nothing, stripped of her pride, her career, her status. Every time she walked into the airport, she carried the burden of her own humiliation, a constant reminder of what happened when someone crossed the wrong man. But why then did it feel so hollow? The public reaction, a legend or a villain. In the days following the flight, the world had erupted with opinions. Some people hailed Baldwin as a legend, a businessman who didn't just take insults lying down, but turned them into billion-dollar victories. He played the long game and won. Ruthless. Genius. Emily thought she could embarrass a billionaire. Now, look at her. Karma at its finest. Others, however, saw something different. This wasn't just business. This was personal. And personal vendettas at this level of power? Dangerous. He didn't just fire her, he destroyed her. Was that really necessary? Christopher had anticipated this reaction. He had spent his entire career cultivating a reputation, one of dominance, control, and invincibility. He had always believed that fear was the ultimate currency. Yet, for the first time in his life, he found himself questioning his own philosophy. Was power truly measured by how many people feared you? Or was there something more? A private conversation that changed everything that evening? Christopher received a call from Martin Reynolds, one of the oldest board members of Imperial Airways. "Baldwin," Martin greeted, his voice rough with age and experience. "I've been meaning to speak with you." Christopher leaned back in his chair. "Then speak." A pause. Then Martin sighed. "I've seen men like you before." Christopher raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" "Yes," Martin continued. "Men who think that absolute control is the only way to lead. Men who mistake destruction for strength. And you know what happens to them?" Christopher remained silent. "They win," Martin admitted. "For a while, but eventually they become so consumed with proving a point that they forget the real game. And before they know it, their entire empire collapses under the weight of their own ego." Christopher exhaled slowly, staring out at the London skyline. "You think I've made a mistake?" "I think you've lost perspective." The words hit deeper than Christopher expected. Martin chuckled lightly. "The airline is thriving under your leadership. No one questions your ability to run a company, but tell me something, Baldwin. Are you leading or are you punishing?" Christopher frowned. "What's the difference?" Martin sighed. "You'll figure it out sooner or later." The call ended, but the conversation lingered in Christopher's mind, repeating itself over and over like a puzzle he was suddenly desperate to solve. Emily Dawson was a ghost of the woman she had once been. Each day she dreaded waking up, knowing that another shift at Imperial Airways meant another battle against her own shame. Passengers still recognized her, some whispering behind her back, others taking cruel pleasure in reminding her of her fall from grace. Her fellow employees didn't know how to treat her anymore. Some avoided her entirely. Others watched her with pity, as if waiting for the moment she finally broke completely. And she was close. Her savings were dwindling. Her confidence was shattered. And the worst part? She had no idea how to move forward. Then one day she received a letter. Hand-delivered, no return address. She tore it open with shaking hands and stared at the contents. It was a single message, typed in bold letters. "Meet me. 9 p.m. Savoy Hotel, penthouse suite." At the bottom, a single signature, Christopher Baldwin. Emily's hands tightened around the letter. Her first instinct was to burn it, to tear it apart and pretend she had never seen it. But deep down, she knew she didn't have a choice. Because whether she liked it or not, Christopher Baldwin still controlled her fate. And if he was calling her to a meeting, it meant only one thing. Something was about to change. The meeting that would decide. Everything that night, Emily walked into the lavish penthouse suite of the Savoy Hotel, her heart hammering so hard it hurt. The room was dimly lit, illuminated only by the glow of London's skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. And there, standing by the window, holding a glass of scotch, was the man himself. Christopher Baldwin turned as she entered, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Emily swallowed hard and forced herself to say it. "Why am I here?" Christopher studied her for a long moment before finally speaking. "Because I want to know something." Emily clenched her fists. "What?" His gaze was unwavering. "Do you regret it?" Her throat went dry. "Regret what?" "That day on the plane, the way you looked at me, the way you dismissed me." She exhaled sharply. "I regret everything." For the first time, something in Baldwin's face softened, a flicker of something she had never seen before. Then he set his glass down and spoke words she never expected to hear. "I'm done." Emily's eyes widened. "Done?" He nodded. "I made my point, but I'm not going to keep you trapped in this." Emily stared at him, trying to decipher his intentions. "What does that mean?" she asked cautiously. Christopher leaned against the edge of his desk, arms crossed. "It means your debt to me is paid. As of tomorrow, you're free to leave Imperial Airways." Emily felt as if the ground had just disappeared beneath her feet. "You're Letting me go? He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. I am. Her hands shook. Her mind spun. She had been prepared for anything, but not this. Not freedom, not mercy. Emily searched his face for an answer. Why? Christopher sighed, running a hand through his hair. Because I finally figured out the difference, he murmured, between leading and punishing. Emily didn't know what to say, because for the first time since this war had begun, Christopher Baldwin had just done something she never thought possible. He had let go. For the first time in months, Emily Dawson felt something she hadn't in a long time. Hope. She sat there in the middle of Christopher Baldwin's luxurious penthouse suite, staring at him in disbelief. I'm free? She whispered. Baldwin gave a slow nod, his gaze unreadable. Yes. Emily's heart pounded as she tried to process his words. After everything, after the humiliation, the power games, the media storm, the slow, calculated erosion of her confidence, he was just letting her go? Her hands trembled in her lap. Why now? She finally asked. Baldwin exhaled, setting his glass of scotch on the table beside him. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned toward the window, looking out at the London skyline as if searching for something in the sea of lights. Because I won, he said simply. Emily swallowed hard. She knew he wasn't just talking about business. He had won the war between them. She had fallen. And now he was choosing to walk away. It should have angered her, should have made her want to fight back, to demand something more than just his mercy. But instead, all she felt was relief. Christopher Baldwin had spent his entire life winning. He had taken companies, crushed competitors, outmaneuvered rivals, and built an empire on the foundation of his relentless drive. But tonight, for the first time, he asked himself, at what cost? He had done what he set out to do. Proven a point, exacted his revenge, and reshaped Imperial Airways in his image. And yet, as he looked at Emily, he saw something different than the woman who had thrown him off the plane all those months ago. She was no longer the arrogant flight attendant who had underestimated him. She was broken, yes, but stronger for it. She had been forced to confront her own flaws, her own blind spots, and in doing so, she had come out the other side someone new. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had set out to destroy her, but in the process, he had transformed her. And now, he realized, she wasn't the only one who had changed. Christopher Baldwin had spent his entire life believing that power meant control. But tonight, for the first time, he wondered if true power meant knowing when to let go. Emily's final decision. Emily's pulse was racing as she stared at the man who had rewritten the course of her life. Her voice was cautious. So, what happens now? Christopher turned back to her, his expression softer than she had ever seen it. You can leave Imperial Airways. No blacklists, no repercussions. You're free to start over. Her breath hitched. Start over. The words sounded foreign, like something from another lifetime. For months, she had felt trapped in a cage of his making. But now the door was open. She could walk away. She could rebuild. Yet, something in her hesitated. Something inside her whispered, not yet. Emily took a shaky breath. What if I don't want to leave? Christopher raised an eyebrow. You want to stay? She exhaled, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. Not like this. He studied her for a long moment, something unreadable flickering in his gaze. Emily swallowed hard. I don't want to stay as some kind of punishment, some lesson for you to teach. I want to stay because I've changed, and if I leave now, it'll feel like I ran away. She shook her head. I don't want to run away anymore. Silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Baldwin gave her a slow nod. Then stay. Not as a flight attendant, not as a servant, but as someone who had learned, who had fought, who had survived. And for the first time since this war had begun, they were finally on equal footing. Christopher's next move: building a legacy. As the weeks passed, Christopher Baldwin did something he never thought he would do. He changed. For years, he had operated under the belief that power was about fear, that being the most dominant, the most ruthless, was the only way to stay on top. But now he realized power was about more than just winning battles. It was about building something that lasted. And so Christopher shifted his focus. He implemented massive reforms at Imperial Airways, creating new leadership programs, restructuring employee policies, and improving customer service at every level. No longer was the company just a tool for revenge. It was becoming something greater, a legacy. And at the heart of it, surprisingly, was Emily Dawson. She had been his adversary, his downfall, his lesson to teach. But now, she was his proof that transformation was possible. She stayed with the company, not as a flight attendant, but as part of its customer experience team, working to reshape the culture from the inside. She wasn't just a symbol of his power anymore. She was a symbol of change. And Christopher Baldwin, for the first time in his life, wasn't just a man who had taken something. He was a man who had built something. The final meeting months later, Emily stood in Baldwin's office, looking out over the city skyline. She turned to him. "You did it." He arched an eyebrow. "Did what?" She smiled faintly. "Built something worth remembering." Christopher studied her, a slow smirk playing on his lips. "So did you." She nodded. "I used to think power meant controlling people." She met his gaze. "Now I think it means inspiring them." Christopher exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "You might be right." A long pause. Then, with a small smirk, he added, "But I still enjoy control." Emily laughed softly, shaking her head. "I know." For the first time, they were no longer enemies, no longer trapped in a war of pride and revenge. They were something else entirely. Two people who had been transformed by the battle they fought. And as Christopher Baldwin looked out over his empire, he realized he had found something more valuable than victory. He had found purpose. Epilogue, order, a legacy beyond power. Christopher Baldwin's name would be remembered, not just as a billionaire, not just as the man who had taken an airline out of vengeance, but as a leader who turned revenge into redemption, who learned that real power wasn't in breaking people, it was in helping them rise. And that, in the end, was the greatest victory of all. The lesson from this story is that power should never be mistaken for invincibility, and arrogance can lead to one's downfall. Emily believed she had control over a situation based on her authority in the moment, failing to recognize that true power often operates silently but decisively. Christopher Baldwin, on the other hand, initially saw power as dominance and revenge. But through his journey, he learned that real strength comes not from destroying others, but from transforming situations into lasting success. This story also highlights the importance of humility, respect, and self-awareness. Emily's fall wasn't just about one mistake, it was about a pattern of behavior that caught up to her. Meanwhile, Christopher's ultimate lesson was that power wielded without wisdom leads to an empty victory. True leadership isn't about punishing others, it's about knowing when to let go, build something greater, and leave a lasting legacy. In the end, both characters had to evolve. Emily learned to rebuild herself, and Christopher discovered that power is most effective when it inspires rather than intimidates.